The girl had been left at the depot with nothing but a worn satchel and a paper tag pinned to her dress, her name written in shaky letters that were already smudged by the dust of the long ride west. She sat there quietly, shoulders tight, as families reunited around her, as wives rushed into their husbands' arms, as children clung to mothers who had come to meet them. But no one called her name. No one claimed her. The station master glanced her way now and then, uneasy, as though the forgotten child might somehow tarnish the order of the bustling platform. She did not cry. She had already learned, too young, that tears only made others look away faster. So she folded her hands in her lap and sat straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for something she didn't dare expect. Evening fell, the lamps lit, and still she sat. Finally, when the last of the crowd drifted off, the sheriff arrived. He had come for another matter entirely, some trouble reported out on the range, but the sight of the small figure sitting alone stopped him cold. He had buried his wife 2 winters past, and since then he had carried his grief like a weight that no bullet, no outlaw, no whiskey could lift. The town leaned on him for order, but when he returned to his house each night, the silence pressed on him like a second grave. He had not expected to feel anything stir inside him again. Yet when the child lifted her eyes to his, there was something raw and unguarded there that cut straight through his worn armor. "Is someone coming for you?" he asked, his voice rougher than he meant. She shook her head once, barely moving, as if afraid even that small gesture might cost her what little place she had left in the world. The sheriff sighed, rubbed the brim of his hat against his knee, then offered a hand she was hesitant to take. "Come on, then. Can't leave you sitting here." He brought her to his home, that lonely house that had known only silence and the ticking of the old clock since his wife's passing. At first, she sat on the edge of the chair, stiff as a soldier, eyes darting as if someone might still come to haul her back to the station. But the sheriff warmed some stew left from his supper, set the bowl before her, and turned away as she ate, giving her the dignity of privacy. He heard the spoon clink against the bowl, heard the soft sound of swallowing, and felt something shift inside him. Days passed. The town whispered, some suspicious, some curious. A sheriff with a child in his care was not the story they were used to. Yet the girl carried herself with quiet strength, and he with steady patience, and soon the murmur of disapproval turned into nods of approval, then into smiles when she walked past. She began sweeping the porch in the mornings, feeding the chickens out back, sitting in church pew beside him on Sundays. For the first time since the funeral, the sheriff found himself looking forward to evenings, knowing there would be a small voice asking him about his day, small feet patting down the hall. But it was not only he who gave her shelter. She gave him something he thought had been buried forever. She filled the empty spaces in that house with a laughter he had almost forgotten existed, with questions and wonder, with the simple miracle of another heartbeat under the same roof. Where once he had only seen his grief, now he began to see her future, and with it, perhaps his own healing. The town grew to accept her as if she had always been there, the station platform a memory fading into dust. She was no longer the child left unclaimed. She had been given a room, yes, but more than that, she had been given belonging, safety, and the steady love of a man who had once thought his heart had closed forever. And in return, she gave the widowed sheriff a reason to rise each morning, a reason to come home each night, a reason to believe that perhaps the hardest losses could one day bloom into unexpected grace. The nights were still the hardest for him. Even after months of having her in the house, there were times when he lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faint rhythm of her breathing down the hall. The sound was steady, a reminder that he was no longer entirely alone, yet it also stirred memories he had buried. He thought often of his wife, the gentle hands that used to fold laundry by lamplight, the voice that hummed quiet hymns as supper cooked. He had believed he would never feel warmth in that house again. And now, strangely, he felt both haunted and healed at once. The child was not his blood, nor his responsibility by law, yet she had become the pulse of his days. In the mornings, he found her already awake, perched on the porch steps, watching the sun rise over the valley. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't. But when she did, her words carried a weight beyond her years. She asked about the people in town, about the land stretched wide and wild, about what it meant to belong. He answered her as best he could, though he often felt clumsy with words. Still, she seemed to find comfort in his attempts. Her eyes softened, her shoulders loosened, and slowly, a fragile trust grew. The town had begun to notice the change in him. Where once he had been a figure of stern authority, sharp with his words and quicker with his temper, now there was a gentleness, even if rough-edged. Folks said the sheriff carried himself differently, as though the burden of solitude had been lifted, even just a little. The saloon keeper remarked that he drank less these days, preferring to go home after rounds. The schoolteacher noticed the girl walking beside him when he stopped by the schoolhouse, asking quiet questions about when classes would resume after the harvest break. It was as though both of them, man and child, were learning how to step back into a world that had once turned cold. Yet not everyone looked kindly. There were whispers from those who mistrusted the arrangement. Some said he was only keeping her out of pity, that sooner or later she'd be sent away to some orphanage downstate. Others muttered darker things, suspicion bred by ignorance. But the sheriff was no stranger to gossip. He had dealt with it all his life, from his early days as a deputy, when people doubted his mettle, to the sorrow that followed his wife's death, when every move he made was measured against the memory of what he had lost. This was no different. He chose silence, letting time prove what words could not. The girl herself grew stronger. She began to smile more, though rarely in public. She still carried the quiet reserve of someone who had been left behind too often. But when she thought no one was watching, she would laugh, quick and bright, at the chickens flapping clumsily or at the sheriff's horse snorting when she brushed his mane. The sheriff noticed these moments from a distance, never interrupting them, letting them bloom naturally. He knew better than to force joy on someone who had lived without it. Autumn settled over the town, crisp mornings and long evenings by the fire. The sheriff taught her small things: how to chop wood safely, how to mend a tear in cloth, how to saddle a horse. Each lesson was more than it appeared. In teaching her, he was teaching himself how to live again, how to nurture rather than merely endure. And she, in her eagerness to learn, reminded him that the world still held possibility. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled, she asked him about his badge. She had seen him wear it every day, the star that marked him as protector of the town, but she had never asked what it truly meant. He held it in his palm for a long time before answering. "It means I've got a duty," he said slowly. "Not just to keep law and order, but to make sure folks have a place where they feel safe. It's heavy sometimes. Heavier than most think. But it matters." She nodded, her small face serious, as though weighing the words. "Like keeping me safe," she said softly. The sheriff swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected her to tie it so directly, but she was right. Perhaps that star had brought him more than just responsibility. Perhaps it had brought him to her. Winter came sharp and unforgiving. Snow blanketed the fields, and the roads turned treacherous. The town huddled close, fires burning late into the night. Illness swept through, as it always did in the cold months, and the sheriff found himself busier than ever. Yet even in the midst of long days and weary nights, he returned home to find her waiting, a lamp lit in the window. She began to greet him at the door, handing him a cup of warm broth or helping him hang up his coat. These small gestures wrapped around his tired heart like balm. Then came the night of the blizzard. He had been called out to settle a dispute between neighbors, their tempers as hot as the winds were cold. By the time he trudged back, snow was piled high, and the wind cut through his coat. When he finally pushed open his own door, shivering and half frozen, he found her curled up on the chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, waiting. She sprang up when she saw him, worry etched into her face. Without a word, she fetched another blanket and draped it over him, her small hands trembling. Something inside him broke open then, not in pain, but in recognition that this child was no longer just a guest, no longer just a duty. She was family. The months turned, as they always did. Spring brought thaw and new life. The sheriff planted a small garden out back, something his wife had once dreamed of but never seen flourish. This time, he planted it with the girl's eager help. Together, they tilled the soil, sowed seeds, and waited for green shoots to break through. It became their ritual, something they both looked forward to after long days. And when the first flowers bloomed, her delight was so unguarded, so radiant, that he found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in years. There were challenges, of course. She carried scars that did not fade easily. Some nights she woke from nightmares, crying out in fear of abandonment, certain she would be left once more. Each time, the sheriff came to her side, sitting quietly until her breathing slowed, sometimes staying until dawn. He never promised that the world was safe, he knew too well it wasn't, but he promised she would not face it alone. Slowly, she began to believe him. The townspeople began to see what had grown between them. They saw the way she walked beside him, the way she straightened her back when he praised her, the way she spoke with a quiet confidence that had once been absent. They saw the way he softened when she was near, how his laughter returned, low and warm, how his eyes lit when she tugged at his sleeve. And they saw, too, how the house that had once stood in shadow now seemed filled with light. By summer, no one questioned whether she belonged. She was woven into the fabric of the town, helping the schoolteacher with books, running errands for the general store, learning hymns with the church choir. The sheriff, too, found himself more grounded, his grief no longer a chain but a memory folded gently into the past. Together, they had built something neither of them had expected, a home. As the years stretched on, the bond only deepened. The sheriff grew older, lines etching deeper into his face, but his spirit steadied with the knowledge that he had not been left to wander in sorrow. The girl grew taller, stronger, her voice carrying more certainty, her laughter ringing more freely. Their lives, once marked by absence, became defined by presence, by the simple, enduring fact that they had found each other when no one else had come. When he looked back on the day he first saw her, small and forgotten on that depot bench, the sheriff realized how much had changed in ways he never could have foreseen. He had thought he was giving her a room, a roof, a meal, nothing more than shelter until something permanent could be arranged. But life had its own arrangements, and the emptiness that had weighed on him since his wife's passing was slowly filled by her presence. She had given him back something he thought was lost forever, the will to keep living, not just out of duty, but out of love. The girl, too, had been altered by the years they had shared. No longer the fragile child with wary eyes, she grew into a young woman whose heart bore both the scars of her beginnings and the strength born of being chosen when no one else would. The knowledge that someone saw her worth, that someone refused to let her slip away unnoticed, became the foundation she stood on. She had not been claimed by blood, nor by obligation, but by a decision of the heart, and that kind of belonging carried a power deeper than heritage. The town itself bore witness to their quiet transformation. People came to see not a sheriff who had once lived in the shadow of grief, but a father who had embraced a child as his own. They saw not an orphan left behind, but a daughter whose place was no longer in question. And in the small exchanges, her hand slipping into his as they walked down the street, his voice softening when he called her name, the community understood that family was not always made in the ways people expected. Sometimes it was forged in the crucible of loss, tempered by resilience, and sealed by the choice to stay. As the sheriff aged, he often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the horizon as he used to, but now with her beside him. The silence no longer pressed on him as a burden, it settled instead as a companionable peace. He had found his reason to wake each morning, his reason to come home at night, his reason to believe that even the hardest winters could give way to spring. She had found her anchor, her safe place, the proof that she mattered in a world that once seemed eager to forget her. And so the story of a widowed sheriff and a forsaken child became something far more than chance. It became a testament to the unexpected mercies of life, to the resilience of hearts willing to open again, and to the truth that sometimes love does not come the way we expect, but it comes just the same. In finding each other, they had both been given more than a second chance, they had